Boa tarde, sejam bem-vindos. Mais um encontro do Tiaços, nessa sexta-feira, dia 18 de agosto de 2023. Hoje a gente tem um Tiaços muito especial. Nós vamos receber nosso querido amigo mexicano, queridíssimo amigo Gustavo Beck. Eu vou contar uma história sobre o Gustavo, deixa eu apresentá-lo primeiro conforme as regras da casa. Não ria, Gustavo, não ria. Gustavo Beck é psicoterapeuta junguiano e arquetípico, com clínica na Cidade do México e tradutor de livros e ensaios sobre psicologia e humanidade. O Gustavo recebeu seu PhD em estudos mitológicos na Pacific Graduate Institute, em Santa Bárbara, Califórnia, e publicou vários ensaios sobre o trabalho de James Hillman e a escola arquetípica de pensamento. Gustavo lecionou no Departamento de Psicologia da Universidade Ibero-Americana, na Cidade do México, e atualmente ele é professor na Pacific Graduate. É candidato sênior no programa de treinamento analítico do Instituto C.G. Jung de Chicago, e os seus interesses giram em torno do pensamento junguiano e pós-junguiano, bem como da teoria arquetípica e sua relação com as questões sociais, culturais e ambientais contemporâneas. Eu conheci o Gustavo, eu acho que em 2008, num evento em Pittsburgh, em homenagem aos 80 anos do Hillman. Foi lá que nós nos conhecemos pela primeira vez, e desde lá estabelecemos uma grande parceria, uma forte amizade, nos vimos várias vezes em outras ocasiões. Gustavo já esteve no Brasil também algumas vezes, esteve no Instituto Freedom, participando do Freedom Day. É um amigo queridíssimo, gosto muito do Gustavo, uma pessoa que eu admiro muito intelectualmente, acho que ele ocupa hoje, dentro do campo da psicologia arquetípica e pós-junguiana, um lugar de muita particularidade, um pensamento muito contemporâneo, atual e atento a questões que são questões fundamentais do nosso tempo e que nem sempre estão na pauta da temática clássica junguiana. Então, para mim, para a Luciana, é uma grande alegria ter o Gustavo aqui, e por um motivo também fundamental. Há 3 anos atrás, quando nós inauguramos o Tiaços, o Gustavo foi nosso primeiro convidado. Sabia, né, Gustavo? Você foi nosso primeiro convidado. Então, a gente
I
estreou.
know, I remember, yes.
Pois é, então foi uma tremenda aposta no escuro que a gente fez, e o Gustavo veio com a gente nessa aposta. 3 anos depois, estamos aqui com mais de 100 apresentações. E para nós, querido amigo, ter você de novo é sempre uma imensa alegria. Você sabe que aqui é a tua casa, você sabe da nossa amizade. Fique à vontade, tá bom? Prazer imenso te receber.
Thank you, my friend. I do want to say that I do feel home, and I do feel the friendship, and I do feel the love, and yeah, I just really love you. Which, curiously enough, is going to be important for the presentation later on. But anyway, so how about we begin? I think, Luciana, can you help me with yeah. So let's begin. Okay, so give me 1 second because I have to take my notes out. Here they are. Okay. So the first thing I want to say is that I am quite anxious about this presentation. And I am anxious for many reasons. But I'm anxious because it's not, I mean, for those of you who know me, I'm a bit obsessive about these things. So it's not a really tight presentation. It's not structured enough. It's not, it doesn't have, deliberately, but it doesn't really have a clear argument. and it speaks about many things. And all these things are very clearly interconnected for me in my experience, but I am not that, I'm not sure, and I'm a bit insecure about whether that's going to come across or not. So what it speaks about, I want to speak about money. I want to speak about inequality. I want to speak about literature. I want to speak about relationships, friendship, love, all kind of at the same time. So in a way, it's a little bit, I don't know, overwhelming or intense, no? It also speaks about shadow, about the trickster, about reflection, and about death. So in a way, it's too much, and it's also too little, and I don't know if I wove it together properly, so I'm a bit anxious. But however, this looseness in the way it's connected is deliberate. I mean, it also has to do with my own inability and incapacity and my own limitation. But the whole point of this presentation is that as psychologists and clinicians, and especially as Jungians, facing limitation is one of the most important things. So these lack of structure, this open-endedness, this flexibility, is my way of just being sort of really candid about and sort of sincere about my limitations, and so just share them with you. Anyway, so in a way, it's kind of like patchwork, like quilting, you know, like when you have a lot of pieces of a lot of things and you stitch them together and you make a blanket. That's kind of what I'm imagining. So let's cuddle under the blanket for a little bit. So if you could put the next one, Luciana, please. Thank you. Perfect. You can hit the next one. So that's one of my favorite Jung quotes. So I'm just going to read it because I really love it. It says, "What is it at this moment and in this individual that represents the natural urge of life?" That is the question, right? And I want to begin with this because this paper in many ways is about questions. And this is the first one I want to pose. It is much more important to me that we arrive at precise, meaningful, meticulous questions than we arrive at answers. My whole point of departure is that there are no real answers to what I'm trying to sort of share with you today. So I want to pose efficient and deep and meaningful questions more than anything else. And the other thing is, I mean, I really just don't have the answer. So that's, you can call it just a trick so that I don't have to provide anything. But in all seriousness, I do want to provide, to give the space to ask the proper questions about this topic. So, and I'm interested also in your own questions and in your maybe tentative answers that can lead to other questions. And my assumption is that these answers, these questions are all embedded in stories, and very specifically for the purposes of this presentation, in stories about encounters, in stories about relationships, in stories where one person meets the other or one person meets others and is confronted by that encounter, right? So that's what I'm interested in today. Yeah, can I have the next one, please? Now, the other thing that I want to do, though, is I want to twitch that Jungian quote a little bit. You can keep going, Luciana, please. So I want to ask the same thing, but I want to say, so what is it at this moment in this, not only individual that represents the natural urge of life, but in this family, in this group, in this community, in this town, in this city, in this nation exactly, in this world? What I am interested in, and the reason I love this Jungian quote is because, at least in my understanding, it really captures what Jungian work is about, which is asking ourselves where the energy is, what charges us, what provokes us, what triggers us, where are we engaged both individually in our inner world, but also in the outer world. For me personally, this issue, the issue of inequality, of economics, of money, et cetera, is an issue that I feel is very charged. And that is partially because of my own personal history, but I also think it's because of the history of the Jungian movement itself. I think that Jungian psychology psychology in general, but specifically Jungian psychology, has a lot to work when it comes to economics, money, and inequality. Or if we want to put it differently, I think we have to work through our money complex, if you want to call it that. So I want to extend that quote and keep the spirit of that quote in terms of where the energy is, but extend it to these other realms, not only the individual. Because I mean, at the end, this paper is in many ways about the capitalistic shadow of psychology and of Jungian psychology. And one of the main elements of capitalism is the emphasis on individuality. So I don't want to fall into that so quickly. So if we go to the next one, I want to ask you some questions for you to think about. So I want to ask you why you are here, and keep the previous quote in mind. I also want to ask you, what draws you to Jungian psychology? What is it that pulls you in? What was your first encounter with Jung like? Why were you drawn into it? Why do you stay in Jungian psychology? Also, is there anything you find repulsive about Jungian psychology? Is there anything you don't like? Is there anything that you reject? Is there anything that disgusts you about Jungian psychology? So I want us to start thinking in terms of where this energy is, and both what draws us in and what pushes us away from Jungian psychology, from psychology in general, and from our practice. Also, what is it in you? Could we go back for a second? Yeah. What is it in you that best represents this natural urge of life? No. And very specifically, I want to ask you, what is it in you, the Jungian, not you, the person, but you, the Jungian psychologist, or the Jungian scholar, or just the Jungian, the person interested in Jung? What is it what best represents the urge of life in that? What situates you in life as a Jungian? For me, that's an important question. Anyway, now we can go to the next one. Now, what I want to do now is dissect the title of my presentation and kind of explain a little bit what I want to do. So can we go ahead, Luciana, please? Yeah. So let me go into the different elements of my title. Yeah, perfect. So one is justice, failure, and the next one, let's stop there, and analysis. These three are, for me, sort of the bigger, if you want to call it that, the more archetypal. I want to see these themes from a wider lens. No, so these are sort of the three main guiding posts of my presentation, and then there's others three which are the psychological, the political, and the socioeconomic. Right? Could you do the next ones, please, Luciana? Thank you. Which are more on the cultural level. No, if we wanted to be theoretical about it, we could say that the first three are more, I want to do more of an archetypal examination, and in these ones I want to do more of a cultural complex kind of examination. And then the final three words of the subtitle have to do with, could you put the next ones, please? Thank you. Thank you, with my Jungian identity. So these last three have to do with how I personally, as an individual, I'm connected to both those archetypal forces of justice, failure, and analysis, and with the more I would say, cultural and historical dimensions of the psychological, the political, and the socioeconomic. It is very important for me in this presentation, and this, I mean, in general, but to keep the three levels in mind. Because if we emphasize one over the other, or if we let go of one, we will have, we could say, sort of a neurotic approach. So if we let go of the archetypal, it could become too personal and narcissistic. If we rally too much on the archetypal, it could become a little bit detached. If we go too much into the cultural, it could be an interesting historical analysis, but it might lack some sort of in-depth meaning. So I want to try to do the three things simultaneously, possible, right? So let me dissolve this further with the help of some very intelligent friends. Can we go to the next one, please, Luciana? So let's start with justice, failure, and analysis. Let's keep going. There's justice with her sword and the balance. Let's do the next one. So this is from Hillman. He says, sometimes we forget that the application of law by a judge is an operation of feeling, and that laws were invented not merely to protect property or assure the priesthood and ruling class of their power, but also to evaluate difficult human problems and to do justice in human affairs. Judging is a matter of feeling, just as in the temples of Saturn, a balance was displayed, or a Saturn in a horoscope is said to be well placed within the sign of Libra. So here, I mean, I do want to nod to Marcus's usual joke about me and the Senex. I do have a connection with Saturn, but I want to emphasize that for me, the interest in justice comes from a very sort of felt experience. I want to sort of emphasize that justice is not an abstract thing that we're exploring. It has to do with a very intimate feeling with things being right or things being wrong, things fitting or not fitting, things being in order or not in order. This is a very Homanian take. If we are psychologically attuned, injustice will not sit well with us. If we're psychologically attuned, injustice will bother us. The only way for injustice not to bother us is to be dissociated from it, is to be disaffected from it. But if we're disaffected from it, we have to be disaffected from many other things, and we're not in line with soul, right? So we can certainly approach justice abstractly and without feeling. But if we do that, we're not really respecting the psychological dimension of justice. And that is the one that I am interested in today. Could we do the next one, please, Luciana? So, about failure. This is Lopez Pedraza. He says, consequently, if our aim is to achieve consciousness of failure, we should be more disposed to understand it as a consciousness trying to be reconciled with something that is obscure, the suffering in a part of our nature that has been rejected. Again, this paper in many ways is about what we reject, what remains in the darkness. I do think, and I think many sort of agree with me, at least partially, that one of the things that remains most in the darkness in psychological practice and in the Jungian field is a very shady relationship with money and with economics. And this might sound a bit dull and not as interesting as talking about symbols or archetypes or aesthetics or whatever, but it is important because it is in the shadow and it is there all the time and it has very real consequences. And engaging with those real consequences and I would say our failed sense of justice and our failed relationship with money and economy will make us more psychological beings. That's kind of the reason why I write this. Okay, the next one is analysis, right? So I'm specifically interested in failure, injustice and failure in the context of analysis. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Hillman. He says, analysis is too potent to be got rid of so easily. It is too much a part of the century's self-conception, too much a requirement of its ego psychology. That's interesting to imagine analysis as part of the ego psychology of a century. Analysis will be ended when we discover what myth it is enacting, a discovery which may not come at all, which may not come all at once, but which occurs at insights that reveal the relation of analysis to soul making. So many things are important for me here. One is the presupposition that Hillman makes that analysis will end. That is a hopeful presupposition for me. I hope that one day analysis ends. And I hope so, again, in the context of this paper, because analysis is very much enmeshed, entangled with the shadows of the late 19th century, the 20th century at the beginning of the 20th century, which have to do with capitalistic logic, with emphasis on individuality, and with deep inequality between people. So in many ways, it is not let me put it like this. The reason why I try to go into these shadows is because I have a very, how to put it? I resent my own capitalistic self, but my own capitalistic self is a twin brother of my clinical psychologist self. So I know that if I really want to make the world a more just place, I have to come to terms with the failings of my own profession. And that it is likely that if the world as I envision it, more oriented towards social justice, so towards equality, towards fellowship, et cetera, is ever to come, that will kill analysis. That is my position. Anyway, let's keep on going. Next, please, Luciana. Okay, then the psychological, the political, and the socioeconomic. So we're going down. We're going from very big archetypal ideas to more sort of ground historical ideas. So this is Andrew Samuels, of course. He says, shameful economic fantasy tells us how even people of progressive views are deeply invested in a system of economic injustice. If we want to change the system, we need to recognize what we are up against. It is about owning our own bit of the system, a piece of shadow from which we can all too glibly detach ourselves. So my intention here is to own that bit of my own shadow, and specifically own a bit of my own shadow as a psychologist. And my invitation is to ask ourselves how we as psychologists, and specifically we as Jungian psychologists, are invested in inequality, how we are invested in the capitalistic system. It is in a way a very difficult bind to try and be anti-capitalist or to be progressive, liberal, and be a Jungian, because there is much of the Jungian opus that rests and it's based in very deep capitalistic values, specifically, in this case, economic inequality. So I want us to look into that on shadow. And the thing there is, of course, we cannot just get rid of it. We have to go into it because it inhabits us, right? I particularly like, is it here? No, but Andrew has this way of putting it that I really like, which it's a concept that he calls economic sadism. So I want us to own our own sadism, and specifically our economic sadism as psychotherapists. Could we go to the next one, please, Luciana? Okay, so then politics, right? I am going to put, this is Andrew Samuels as well from in the political psyche. He says, I am going to politicize countertransference. By so doing, I will reframe and revision clinical practice as a potential link between depth psychology and society, and not as the source of an isolation of depth psychology from society. The clinical can be a bridge to a new way to express and theorize political dissent. So what Samuels does very beautifully, I think, is that he turns or he views the analytical relationship as a relationship that is embedded in a political system, right? So like marriage or like school, like the way we imagine university, those, the way we imagine those and the way we enact those relationships are political stances, right? So what he is saying is that we as psychotherapists, when we are engaging with a patient and his very intimate issues, and we really connect with them via the relationship, but this is very important, we are engaging in political activity. We are taking a political stance depending on how we treat that material and that relationship. The tendency has usually been to emphasize the private, the inner, the individual, the ownership, the responsibility, which are all, again, capitalistic values. But many trends in psychoanalysis are now moving towards a sort of critically viewing that relationship so that we can see how it is either complicit with the system or it can be liberating in regards to the system. And that's also part of my interest. Can we do the next one, please, Luciana? And then the psychological. And here I want to take a very sort of traditional archetypal psychology approach just because it's close to my heart, which is I want us to be able to hold this economic and political issues, but from within a soulful perspective in the Hillmanian sense of the word, right? So Hillman defines the psychological, he defines soul as, he says, we can take soul to refer to that unknown human factor which makes meaning possible, which turns events into experiences, and which is communicated in love. So what we are saying is that these very sort of almost poetic and very intimate and very evocative aspects of psychological life and of psychological relationships are embedded in the political, and that when we take it out to the political, it is still soulful. It is still the way in which we experience these events, these situations, inequality, political upheaval, et cetera, that has very deep psychological meaning for each of us. And for each of us as individuals, but also for us as members of community. So again, this thing about operating in many levels at the same time and being able to remain psychological as we are political or mindful of economics, that is what I'm also interested in. So we go to the next one. Thanks, Lucian. And finally, this thing about my Jungian identity. No, so I do this for many reasons. There's me, and I want to make a ridicule a little bit out of myself, but it is important because what I want to do in this case is I want to emphasize that what I am doing is an exercise in is a reflection of my own positionality and of my own intersectional positionality of who I am as a person and as a psychologist, as a man, as a middle-aged man, as a Mexican man, as a Mexican psychologist that is, relatively speaking, well off economically. And what impact does my subjectivity have in psychological relationships? And what impact does my practice have in the community where I operate, right? So this is Samuel, he says, it is suspicious that depth psychologists concerned with the public sphere have not paid much attention to themselves as a cultural phenomenon. So it is very easy for us psychologists because we have such an intense, beautiful, deep job to just go to our offices and talk about dreams and talk about feelings, cry a little bit, you maybe hug each other or have a little tense moment, and forget that is not only about ourselves. But the thing is, in order to understand ourselves as a political, economic, and cultural phenomenon, we have to go into our actual experience in relation to the world, right? So my intention in doing this is to do this exercise in sort of an examination of subjectivity. I want to try to connect our inner experience with outer experience, the private experience of psychology with the public face of psychology. And my hope is that more people would be able to do that. Now, all right, let's go to the next one. This is Hillman. He says, each psychology is a confession, and the worth of a psychology for another person lies not in the places where he can identify with it because it satisfies his psychic needs, but where it provokes him to work his own psychology in response. This is the other thing, right? So the point here is that we go into this confessionally from our own personality in order to find other people's subjectivities, personalities, and confessions, and to bump into them. That's the whole point, establishing relationships in which we can examine each other's subjectivities, right? So in a way, and that's the reason why I put my photo there, it is a narcissistic exercise as much as psychoanalysis, but it is also an exercise. It is also an erotic exercise. It's an exercise in relating. It's an exercise. I mean, Marcus was talking about friendships. This is crucial, right? So we bump into each other. We are as aware as we can of our own identity and relationship to the field in this case. And from there, we challenge each other into examining our place as psychologists in the world. That's kind of my point. We can go to the next one. So I am pointing towards a healing of this is Guggenbill. And this is a paper that is sort of a precedent to his power in the helping professions. And he is talking about the archetypal shadow in analysis and how the analyst is often split from that shadow. It says, I am pointing towards a healing of that split and that isolation in which the analyst lives. It has to do with being open, actively and passionately, and taking up what comes to him. He must find some way to expose himself to the most difficult existential challenge to his psyche. He must be shaken. I mean, I just love Guggenbill. But if you examine this quote in relationship to Jung's original quote about where the energy is, like where is the natural urge of life, I think this is what Guggenbill is saying, is that in order for an analyst to have psychological integrity, he has to see where that energy is, and he must open himself to it. And if that opening doesn't shake him, if it doesn't make the analyst question everything that he stands for, then he's not really open, right? In my case, this relationship with economics and money is one of the things that really sort of opens me up. Well, and then I included, could we do the next one, Luciana? Because I included a photo just for Marcus's sake. That is the day I met Marcus. And I just thought that including two of myself was simultaneously more narcissistic and less narcissistic, because it implies a certain sort of relationship. But that was the day Marcus and I met in Pittsburgh in 2008. He was right across from me when that was taken. Anyway, next, please. Okay, so to do this thing that I want to do, this is where I'm gonna start the quilting process. I am going to do a lot of things, right? So the first thing I want to do to cure ourselves a little bit from both excessive psychology and excessive kind of subjectivity is I want to sidestep and resort to literature. No? So maybe what some of you know, but this presentation originally sort of derived from a paper that I wrote for a conference in I think it was 2018, and it was published last year. And Marcus, when he saw the paper, he said, "Oh, you should present something on this." So this paper is about exactly what we're talking about, but it is anchored in two very specific things. One is this short tale that I'm going to tell you right now. It's a short story by Borges, and the other one is an experience that I had with my analyst. So, if I may, I would like to tell you this story from Borges. It is a story. Can we go to the next one, please, Luciana? it is a story that is contained, if you're interested, in a book by Borges that is titled, the title is The Book of Sand, and the title of the short story is The Other. No? So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to read a short section of that paper that I'm telling you about, where I retell this story and the relevance for what we're doing, right? So if you're ready, Isa, I'm gonna start. So in 1975, Jorge Luis Borges published a collection of short stories titled The Book of Sand. The first of those stories is titled The Other. It's the one I'm telling you about. And it tells the tale of a conversation between two people who could be described as intimate strangers. For reasons that will hopefully become clear as I move forwards, I will now take some time to describe this encounter as narrated by Borges in his exquisite dreamlike imagery. The protagonist of this story is Borges himself. Borges, then, is writing about Borges. Here we find a first duplicity in the story that is structured through duplicity. Borges described the event that occupies most of the story as almost horrific, which of course begs the question, why almost? Perhaps, I surmise, because the text is not only embedded in the imagery of duplicity, but also in the logic of failure. There is at the heart of the story something that never quite connects, this is my fear from the beginning, and something that never quite works. But before exploring this, let me relay the tale of the encounter. Borges' description begins as follows. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. I was sitting comfortably on a bench beside the Charles River. Large chunks of ice were floating down the great current. This is old Borges talking, a man in his 70s who is already almost completely blind. He narrates the encounter in first person while watching with almost blind eyes the chunks of ice floating past him. Borges, the writer through the voice of Borges in the story, tells us that something happens. This is Borges speaking. Suddenly, I had the sense, and he makes an interesting reference to psychologists here, he says, which psychologists tells us is associated with states of fatigue, that I had lived this moment before. Someone had sat down on the other end of my bench. Old Borges soon realizes that the man sitting on the other end of the bench is also Jorge Luis Borges, but a younger Borges, who lives in Geneva in the 1920s. What we have here, then, is old Borges sitting on a bench with young Borges, a second duplicity. This double duplicity can be summarized as follows. Borges writes a story about Borges' encounter with Borges. Borges, the writer, tells us that Borges is the one who recognizes young Borges, and that the latter is quite skeptical about the realness of this encounter. After guessing or remembering young Borges' address in Geneva, old Borges initiates the following conversation. And that's the quote you have right there. He says, in that case, I resolutely said to him, your name is Jorge Luis Borges. I too am Jorge Luis Borges. We are in 1969 in the city of Cambridge. No, he answered in my own slightly distant voice. I am here in Geneva, on a bench, a few steps from the Rhone. So, the reason I'm taking time to read this, and as confusing as it might sound in my contrived writing, this is the point that I want to make with this story, and the reason why I find it so useful is because it points out, on the one hand, how we, obviously as humans, but in this case specifically as psychologists, we are divided. We want things to be more just, more fair, but at the same time, we are invested in them not being as fair. We are always going against ourselves. But the beauty of the tale is that it turns that split, that dissociation, into an attempt at dialogue. So it simultaneously recognizes that we're divided, that we are fighting against ourselves, and that we are desperately trying to connect with ourselves. And that tension is never fully resolved. That is why I emphasize the question. And that's why I emphasize the feeling, because we are always yearning to connect with that stranger within ourselves. But we also always know that we will never quite connect with that stranger within ourselves. Right? That's kind of what I wanted to emphasize in this story. So I'm going to carry on. It says, let us imagine this. Maybe we can go to the next slide, Luciana. Recognizing one's own younger, slightly distant voice speaking and rejecting us from another place and another time. When facing this, and let me stop there. Imagine that. Imagine you bumping into yourself and that other self of yours rejecting you and not acknowledging your existence. Anyway. When facing this, old Borges attempts to prove to young Borges that this dialogue is actually happening and proceeds to describe many private details of the young man's life, including the contents of his bookshelves. Young Borges, however, does not find this convincing and resorts to an interesting hypothesis for us Jungians. He replies to old Borges, those proofs of yours have prove nothing. If I'm dreaming you, it's only natural that you would know what I know. So interestingly enough, the first attempt to reconcile the distance between these split aspects of ourselves is dream. Oh, I must be dreaming myself, right? And here is where fantasy or dream connects us with ourselves, but also defends us from actually connecting with ourselves, if that makes any sense. So then old Borges concedes to the objection, but responds with a much more psychological and Jungian attitude to the hypothetical dream. And Borges says, if this morning and this encounter are dreams, then each of us does have to think that he alone is a dreamer. Perhaps our dream will end, perhaps it won't. Meanwhile, our clear obligation is to accept the dream as we have accepted the universe and are having been brought into, and the fact that we see with our eyes and that we breathe. So old Borges, curiously enough, makes an appeal for basically the objective psyche, with the fact that a dream is just as real as waking life. Old Borges, speaking almost like an analyst, maintains the distance between him and his bench companion. He respects the other's rejection and skepticism, but provides a space in which such rejection and skepticism can be accepted as a dream. They then start to speak about family, history, and books. All this in old Borges's past, but in young Borges's future. Young Borges speaks about reading Dostoevsky, and then old Borges asks which books he is reading. So an interesting title comes up, The Double. Young, again, the duplicity. Young Borges tells old Borges about his plans to write a book that was to be a hymn to the brotherhood of all mankind, and this turns the tables. For now, it is time for old Borges to be skeptical. So the other reason why I want to include this tale in my presentation about inequality is that, curiously enough, young Borges, the puer, if Marcus allows me that word, is obsessed with brotherhood and with equality and with everybody being together. And old Borges, if Marcus allows me the word, the Senex, immediately comes down with him with these sort of kind of, comical but somewhat sad skepticism, and says this. I thought about this for a while, and then I asked if he really felt he was brother to every living person. Every undertaker, for example. Every letter carrier. Every undersea diver. Everybody that lives on the even number side of the street. Other people with laryngitis. The list could go on. He said his book would address the great oppressed and outcast masses. And then Borges replies, your oppressed and outcast masses, I replied, are nothing but an abstraction. Only individuals exist, if in fact anyone does. So old Borges is really a Jungian, no? But he is struggling with a younger part of himself that still wants to believe in the possibility of a brotherhood of mankind. So if we carry on, that it is interesting to note how the topic of oppression is the one that divides Borges from Borges. It is when they start talking about this subject that what was already a stark split between old and young Borges becomes even starker. If young Borges was skeptical about the reality of the dream, old Borges was skeptical about the reality of people. So this split where we dissociate the material from the psychological, when we dissociate dream from reality, when we use dream to escape from reality or reality to escape from dream, fantasy to escape from the material or the material to escape from reality is the division that I want to address. In this juxtaposition, I'm going to skip a little bit, Isa, to the bottom of the page. In this juxtaposition of similarity and difference, when the sense of our incapability to find a common ground emerges and we start feeling a need for deceit, Hermes makes an appearance. Just when we think we're about to lose the connection, he slips unnoticed through the least expected crack. In Borges' story, he slides in through an abrupt remembrance in old Borges. Suddenly, he says, I recall the fantasy by Coleridge. A man dreams that he is in paradise and he is given a flower as proof. When he wakes up, there is the flower. Borges, the writer, has already set the story within a dreamlike framework. But now the story is pushed even further. Within this impossible imagery, the story is moved forwards by the memory of a fantasy of a dream, right? So, where there's not a tale by Borges, it would be the epitome of Jungian cliches. The memory of a fantasy of a dream is what binds people together. But what is most curious and convenient for this presentation's purposes is that this hermetic appearance has a further twist. After pushing so far into fantasy, memory, and dream, the story moves abruptly into the most mundane of topics, money. Old Borges, so instead of giving the other Borges a rose, this is what he does. He has an idea. He will switch Coleridge's flower for Swiss and American currency. In order to bridge the apparently impossible gap that now divided him from himself, he asks young Borges for money. This propitiated the following exchange. He took, Borges, 3 silver pieces and several smaller coins out of his pocket. He held out one of the silver pieces to me. He didn't understand. I handed him one of those ill-advised American bills that are all of the same size, though of very different denominations. He examined it avidly. Impossible, he cried. This is dated 1964. So the way in which the gap between these two people is bridged is through fantasized money. So the old Borges gives money to young Borges, and that, curiously enough, convinces young Borges that the encounter is real. He doesn't believe in dreams. He doesn't believe in the objective psyche. He believes in money. Let's carry on, please, Luciana, with the next one. To end. There's the bill. Young Borges was finally convinced the bridge had been built through money. The two Borges might have been incapable of connecting, but coins and bills, banknotes, deceived them both into relationship. In the very next line, old Borges provides us with a parenthetical clarification. Months later, he tells us, someone told me that banknotes are not dated. Some dreamlike fantasy lingers within the very real, almost vulgar money. Young Borges was thus convinced by an illusory date in a banknote, an illusion that also convinced old Borges initially. The unreal marking printed in the very real money had deceived both and thus allowed for connection. The gap had been somehow bridged in that bench that existed in 2 times and 2 places. And at the end, Borges reflects this. He says, the encounter was real, but the other man spoke to me in a dream, which was why he could forget me. I spoke to him while I was awake, and so I am still tormented by the memory. The other man dreamed me, but did not dream me rigorously. He dreamed, I now realize, the impossible date on that dollar bill. So, the point here is, and this is, and I mean, I don't know if I wanted to sort of share this story complete with you, is that in this encounter between this sort of fantasy encounter between old Borges and young Borges, one of who is dreaming, the other one who is being dreamed, but in real life, the point of connection is a piece of money that is simultaneously real and fantasized. Could we go to the next one, Luciana, please? Yeah, let's just carry on. That's what I just. So, okay. So I just wanted to use that as a frame for what happened to me. So, and why I wrote this whole paper. So can we carry on? So I was also going to read this, but I'm going to tell you the story. But I'm going to frame it with this quote from Samuels that I used before, but that I want to bring back in order to frame my story. He says, "Shameful economic fantasy tells us how even people of progressive views are deeply invested in a system of economic injustice. If we want to change the system, we need to recognize what we are up against. It's about owning our own bit of the system, a piece of shadow from which we can altogether detach ourselves. The lesson is that this is what I was telling you about. The lesson is that economic sadism is not something you can escape because you want to leap out of the pit." So what I'm now going to tell you is a story about my analysis with a Jungian analyst. Let's do the next one, please. From a while ago. So what happened basically was that I started analysis with someone in the United States. I think it was in 2012. Because my analyst in Mexico left the country and there were not enough analysts in Mexico, and she referred me to this analyst in the US. And basically what happened was that I could not pay what he charged. He charged $150, which for me was impossible to pay. And after a little bit of back and forth and negotiation, I told him, well, you know what we can do? What we can do is I can pay you the equivalent of what I earn in an hour, right? So back then I charged 800 pesos, Mexican pesos, a session, which translated into $65. So we said, okay, you pay me $65, which is an hour of your work. And that seemed like an initial solution to the payment and to it being fair and to it being just, and also crucially to us connecting, right? It was an initial agreement where he conceded, I conceded, and we encountered each other and made an agreement. This was in 2013. But what soon happened, and that's what I am interested in, and again, the reason I took time to tell Borges' story is because my image of that encounter between old Borges and young Borges is that's an analogy or a metaphor for the analytic encounter and how it is uneven, unfair, and we are always trying to connect with someone else and to our inner other, both through fantasy and through realness, right? So, and in the case of me and my analyst, one of these very sort of clear things was we said, okay, I'm going to pay you $65, which was the equivalent of 1 hour of work. But what happened, of course, as I'm sure all of you know, is that money is not a static phenomenon. Money moves, much like psychic energy moves. And because stuff started happening, the Mexican peso started to lose value in the face of the dollar. So as years went by, I was still paying $65 to my analyst, but I was paying more pesos. So there was a point where I was paying 1,400 instead of 800, and he was still receiving 65. And what that started doing was that it started generating very complicated feelings in me. Because on the one hand, I was grateful that he was charging me much less than he charged. On the other one, I resented him because he lived in a country who could totally ignore these sort of exchange rates, et cetera, et cetera. And we talked about this. And it was also the time of when Trump became president. So I also resented the culture for electing Trump. And what happened was that at some point, and can we do the next one, Luciana? Was that at some point, not yet. Could you go back? At some point, I started falling back in my payments. I started not paying my sessions. And first, I didn't pay one session, and then I didn't pay two sessions. And there was a point where I perhaps owed him about 3 months worth of sessions. And one day, and this was several years into analysis, I came into analysis and he received me with one of the most powerful, beautiful interpretations that I have ever received from an analyst. And he said this. Could we go to the next one, Luciana? Luciana, could we go to the next? Yeah. So this is what he told me. He says, okay, before we begin, I need us to talk about something. Money. I'm confused. I cannot figure out whether you are having trouble paying what we agreed or you are trying to screw me. Now, in American English, that expression means two things. It means, one, are you trying to fuck with me? No. Are you trying to treat me as a fool? Are you trying to fool me? Or are you trying to fuck me, as in, are you having to have intercourse with me? So what he did, and I really don't know, and I never asked him if he did it deliberately or not, is that he both named my aggression with him, because I was trying to screw him, I was trying to get away with paying him, but I was also trying to screw him in the sense that I was also wanting to connect with him intimately. And when he named this, when he named that I was both angry at him, I felt distant from him, I felt that I didn't want to be with him, but I also really wanted to be close with him. And all he did, and all this was related to money. In that moment, I began, I would say, to really trust my analyst. When he went into that connection of, I don't want to be with you, I hate you, but I love you and I want to be as close as you as I can. And that happened through money, through unfairness, and through a failure to communicate. Can we go to the next one? Okay, so now I want to turn this to you as some more specific questions for you as Jungian consumers, because you are Jungian consumers. Let's ask a few questions. How much do you pay for your therapy? Let's keep on. Do you think or feel the price is fair? Do you ever think or feel that you paid too much? Do you ever think or feel that you paid too little? How much money do you spend in Jungian stuff? Books, conferences, trips? Has a Jungian ever screwed you? Next one. Have you ever screwed a Jungian? Next one. More questions. But now for you, the Jungian seller, because I know that many of you are therapists or Jungian writers or whatnot. So you're not only consumers, you're also sellers. Let's ask some questions. How do you establish your fee in psychotherapy? Do you think you charge a fair price? Do you ever think or feel you charge too little? Do you ever think or feel you charge too much? Do you ever question your product's value? Do you ever think that you're scamming, that you're just selling something that doesn't have any value? Have you ever been screwed as a Jungian? Has someone, like a client or someone, have they ever screwed you? Or have you ever screwed someone from your position as a Jungian? Have you ever abused your power as a Jungian? Okay, so those questions are just out there. Yeah, let's carry on. Are just out there. I want you to think about it, because in my experience from talking with friends, colleagues, money is a constant issue in Jungian practice and within the Jungian community. Let's carry on. Please, Lucia, the next one. Yeah. So, third story. This is something that I did with the with the $65 coin that I imagined with my analyst, the $65 that I paid. What I did in the paper was a few graphics just to illustrate inequality. So the first one is just the hourly income in US dollars. And if I go to left to right, the furthest left is how much in dollars this was in 2018, a Mexican psychology makes an hour. That is $3 an hour. That was the average hourly income of a Mexican psychologist. Keep in mind that my analyst charged $150 an hour. So 50 times more, okay? Now, the average income of a Chicago, the next column is a Chicago analyst. They would make almost $70. The next was me back when I charged $800. I earned the equivalent to $48. This was when the exchange rate had already changed. When I started writing the paper, that was higher, and then it went lower. Then the next column that you almost cannot see is the Mexican minimum wage, which was back then 60 cents. So Mexican minimum wage, 60 cents. A psychologist makes about 6 times more, 5 times more. I make about 12 or 13 times more, 14 times more than a Mexican psychologist. And a Chicago psychologist makes about 20 times more than a Mexican psychologist. And then the Chicago minimum wage. So my point here is that if we think about the union community, union training, and we think about an international community, these disparities have consequences. One is that it is by definition unfair, but also the one that really tortures me is that the only way to participate from the union community, if you are not from a rich country, is to be rich in your own country. So the problem with accessibility is really important, and that itself has an effect on how we theorize, on how we think, on how we practice. And then we wonder why so much of union theory is biased, either politically, in terms of gender, in terms of race, because there is no actual access to the union community because it's too expensive, right? Let's keep on going. So then I made some more graphs about specifically how many, I made these sort of math trick to see like, okay, if we take those wages, those salaries, that thing that people earn, how much hours are needed to work in order to pay analysis and supervision, right? So the left one, the left 4 columns is how much hours you needed to work in order to pay my analysis, the one that I had, that cost $65, right? So a Mexican psychologist, and here I am not even going to people who live in poverty or to minimum wage living people. I am talking about psychologists, professionals in the field of psychology. A regular psychologist in Mexico City would need to work 20 hours in order to pay 1 hour of analysis in reduced fee. So he would need basically to work 2 10-hour days in order to have 1 hour of analysis. If my analyst would have charged what he actually charged, his usual fee, a Mexican analyst, a Mexican psychologist will need to work almost 50 hours a week, no, more than a week, to pay for 1 hour of analysis. And then the inequality again hits home because me, although I am Mexican, I am the green one. Instead of having to pay 20 hours, I had to pay, so my increase was 34%. So instead of an hour for an hour, it was 1.34 hours for 1 hour of analysis. If my analyst had charged what he actually charged, I would have to work 3 hours to pay for 1 of his hours, right? And supervision, it's the same story. But the point here is how this equation cannot be solved because it is so structurally messed up, right? And the point I am trying to make is yes, we need to make it more even, but before that, as psychologists, our ethical obligation, our psychological commitment is to see this and examine how this makes us feel. Anyway, let's go to the next one. And this one is just ridiculous. This is the amount of hours required to pay tuition for analytical training or a graduate degree in Jungian studies. So for analytical training, how much I paid to be trained as a Jungian analyst, a year, I would need a regular average Mexican psychologist would need to work 1,600 hours. I don't really know how to do the math of that, but I'm pretty sure that is almost, he would probably need to put out there about 70 or 75% of his annual income in order to pay just for the tuition to become an analyst. And then we ask ourselves, oh, why aren't there more, Latin American analysts? Because we can't afford it. I mean, Brazil is, you can tell me about the situation in Brazil, but it's still, the point is, only elites can afford to become analysts. Only elites can be symbolic. I mean, and I'm not going to even talk about the graduate training because that is just ridiculous. So let's keep on going because I want to talk with you a little. And finally, let me just do a little bit of psychological theory. And I'm not going to stop too much, but I just want to. So let's carry on. So I'm using basically 4 people. Hillman, Samuels, I think is the next one. Yeah. Lopez Pedraza, and Guggenbiel. And all these are sort of kind of mirrors of Borges and his story, right? So let's carry on. So my intention is to let's keep on going. Lucian. Yeah. So just to dramatize a little bit. So the way I'm imagining it, when we face this issue, these graphs, this situation is, for me, let's carry on. I use Hillman as a doorway into death, because when Hillman speaks about failure as an entrance into the decaying, into things that need to die, Guggenbiel talks about failure and about sort of brokenness in terms of how it connects us with shadow, right? Next. Lopez Pedraza talks about failure as a means to enter deep, depressive reflection. And Samuels handles it in a way that where he tries to trick us into turning it upside down, where he actually gives us hope through entering into the hopelessness, right? And finally, Borges, just because this is kind of almost like a very Jungian paternity. Next one, Borges is kind of whatever, the quintessence, the fifth element, so to speak. So let me just do a little bit of these theory, and then we can talk a little bit. If we can carry on. I think I'm going to just do. I have 2 slides for each, but we're just going to do the first one. Let's talk about Hillman, failure, and death. Let's carry on. Yeah, keep on. Yeah, okay. So Hillman says, success and failure may be conceived not as opposites or poles of a continuum, but as an identity, so that every analysis is both a failure and a success at the same time. And every part of every analysis is both right and wrong, leading and misleading, constructively growing and deconstructively killing, implying that for analysis to succeed at all, it must always fail. And again, I want to frame this in terms of the encounter. We always want to connect to the other, or in terms of justice. We always want to be fair, but we will always fail somehow in really connecting or in really making justice to the psychological encounter. Can we do the next one? Through just such historical reflection upon the failure of analysis, we may recall that analysis did arise out of failure, and that it was a specific method for dealing with those peculiar kinds of cases that had failed to be understood, or even find a hearing by which the prevailing system, the hysterics of Freud and Breuer, or the schizophrenics of Jung and Bleuler. Those were the medically and socially failed, and psychotherapy was invented as a specific response to these specific failures. The question here, of course, is what happens now, or what happens in general, with those who are failed by the economic system, those who are marginalized by capitalistic economic structures. How can they be tended to the way schizophrenics were tended to by Jung, or hysterics were tended to by Freud? A good book on that, I mean, some of you might know it, is Elizabeth Danto's Freud's Free Clinics. But anyway, but this is the point I want to make. Next. Let's carry on so that we have. So the way Gilman phrases it, he says, rather I would suggest that analysis may continue as before, even where it conceives itself not only as having failed historically and clinically, but as being failure archetypally. So being an analysis, being psychologically, connects us with our failed aspects. With those, he says, as being concerned with failure in the dictionary sense of failure, weakness, defectiveness, absence of victory, bankruptcy, deception, lack, and incompletion. Specifically important for us in this quote is bankruptcy and deception. There is a part of us as analysts which is by definition corrupt. It is in our shadow. It is, and we need to be able to connect with that if we are really to understand how much of a failure our practice is, and if we're to connect with the potential richness of our practice being a failure. We can only really connect with the depths of our practice if we can really feel deeply into how it is a failure before it has even begun. Next one. Then every mistake of life, every weakness and error in and of analysis, instead of being set straight in repentance or wrong of its drop of consciousness or transformed and integrated, becomes rather the entrance to failure, an opening into the reversal of all values. So this is where if we talk about capitalism, it could help us kill the system. Rather than as a block in eros and the flow of life, we might consider failures as constellated, intended, even finally caused by the underworld, which wants life to fail in order that other attitudes governed by other archetypal principles be recognized. If we think of this in terms of capitalism, and if we think that the embeddedness of psychological practice in capitalism has to fail and has to die in order for something else to be born, a new way of practicing psychology, a new way of being psychological, I find this pretty captivating. Anyway, let's carry on. Then Samuels and the trickster, right? Let's see. This is really important. The wealthier the individual, family, clan, class, nation, region, the greater the space for symbolization seems to be. Next one, because it's related. Let's do the next one. If one space for symbolization expands, it can eliminate the other space for symbolization, and hence can eliminate the other, or seem to. Economic inequality does away with the anxieties of alterity, of having to relate to people who are psychologically other. It encourages fantasies of insulation and isolation. So this is super important, right? Because we Jungians are so enamored with symbolization, but because we don't necessarily think of the cultural, political, and economic implications of symbolization, we cannot fathom that if we are in a privileged position, if our position is of power, then when we symbolize, it is very likely that we are going to step into somebody else's symbolization process. This is very clear in gender, in the way men occupy spaces for women. It is very clear in coloniality and the way in which Eurocentric frameworks colonize spaces of symbolization of non-Eurocentric traditions. So this is really important, right? That we think we're doing psychological work, and we are in a way, but we are neglecting how that psychological work is eating up the space for other symbolic systems to operate. Next. Depth psychologists rarely address the questions that arise from an inequitable distribution of wealth. Therefore, we did not know very much about the depth psychological implications of seeking a more equitable distribution. Okay. Next. Hermes, and this is where Samuel sort of picks on Hermes to see, like, okay, this is a way in and a way out. Let's carry on. Alongside the desire to make a good deal, the bargaining process supports and fosters compassion for the other, without whom there would be no bargaining possible. So what Samuel says is that the way out of this sort of, not the way out, but the way to deal with and cope with this very unfair system is bargaining, like one does in the market. But so not the big system of economics, but the way we can sort of undermine it is by, through the cracks, going inside and, haggling. How do you say that in English? So like when you negotiate a price of something, because you understand that prices are arbitrary, that they don't mean anything unless you agree to them, right? That's why this thing with my analyst was important. The image of bargaining is therefore not an unrealistic basis for a rectification of economic injustice. Next one. Hermes speaks of, this is important, right? Because what he is doing is he has invited Hermes, the god of commerce, in order for us to establish relationship through a very messed up system, he says. Hermes speaks for both the inequitable, unjust, cheating side and the creative, transformative, compassionate side of the market. Hermes is a passageway to a depth psychological engagement with the political dynamics of the economic system. So in this way, he's starting to make space for shadow and say, like, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have a back and forth in which you are going to try to screw me, I'm going to try to screw you, and through that screwing each other, we are going to relate in an intimate manner, right? Let's carry on. By engaging with Hermes, we also have to engage with the warring sides of our Hermes selves. On the one hand, our fraud, our criminality, our first person, our criminality, our belief in magic, our love of economic inequality, our own depression-inducing violence. On the other hand, our capacity for exchange, integrity, relatedness, flexibility, our own love of dignity and freedom, our desire to reject coercion and bullying, our skill at making peace. So this is crucial, right? We need to hold both I'm going to be very blunt, the asshole in ourselves, the sadist in ourselves, the criminal in ourselves, and the peacemaker in ourselves, the just man in ourselves, the just woman in ourselves. So this being able to hold the duplicity becomes crucial. Next. Now, Lopez Pedraza and depression and reflection. I don't know why I always think of Cage when I think of Lopez Pedraza. When the need to succeed is a foregone conclusion leading to repetition, we fall victims to the misguided fancy that we deserve success. That's a very capitalist fantasy, that we deserve success, that we deserve to be happy. We don't. In this extreme position, we lose contact with any possibility of reflection, and anything that we understand by success becomes irreflective, thus distancing us from the basic patterns of earthly reality. So the reason why failure is important, the reason why this connection with how unjust the system is important, is because it brings us down to reality, and it brings us down to reality in a reflective manner. We can connect with reality and feel reality impact us and reflect on that experience. Next one. Thus, in psychological and psychotherapeutic studies, those who turn out to be the worst psychotherapists with the most boring theories and writings, those whose personal contributions to psychological studies have been of little value, are precisely those students who began to study psychology from the brilliant, success-oriented angle without amending their one-sidedness in the course of their own studies in psychotherapy. So the point here being, if you want to be a psychotherapist, you have to have failed. You need to experience deeply how broken you are, how stupid you are, how inept you are, how no matter how much you try, you're not going to make it. Because this whole notion of making it, of being successful, of being brilliant, is unpsychological. It is in the depths of this sort of slow depression that we are digested into being psychological beings by the psyche, by the soul. Next one. Almost there. Lopez Pedraza on depression. Yeah. So this is another really good quote by Lopez Pedraza. He says, the moment we are capable of psychically evaluating the experience of soul, we are getting a little closer to what is called a crisis of the soul. So experiencing soul is connecting with the crisis of the soul. We approach and try to adapt ourselves a little better to the wide range of depressions. And it is then that we start to live, feel, and value the depths. The slow movements of depression are the only way. Today we can say with certainty that they are the via regia to what we call psychic creativity. So radical. The way in is through the slow movements of our depression. And again, what is more depressing than the political and economic situation of our day? Let's keep on going. And finally, my friend Guggenbiel on shadow, he says, the personal shadow works destructively against ego ideas. The collective shadow tries to demolish collective ideas. Both those shadows also have a valuable function. Both ego and collective ideals must be repeatedly subjected to attack, since they are false and one-sided. Were they not continually being eaten into from the depths of the human soul, there would be neither individual nor collective development. So just like the others speak about failure, about these sort of shady parts of ourselves, Bougainville talks about how the destructiveness of the shadow makes space for new aspects of the soul to emerge. And this thing that he says, it's so beautiful. He says how these elements are eaten. The soul, the psyche, eats them up and digests them, and that is how transformation happens. And that happens through the destruction, through the destructive aspect of the soul. So defending against destruction is defending against the life that comes out of destruction. Yeah, let's keep on going. He says, perhaps we have reached the point where the analyst will look in all modesty for possibilities outside his own calling to protect himself from the tragic consequences of his own calling. Bougainville's argument, which I think is brilliant, is that as analysts or as psychotherapists, the more we work on ourselves and the more conscious we are, the more shadow we cast, the more shadow there is, the more unconsciousness there is. And as we do that, what we tend to do is, because we're so worked, we're so evolved, we're so differentiated, we're so wise, we detach ourselves from specifically the archetypal destructive aspects of the shadow, the archetypal shadow. So he continues and he says, the analyst's entanglement in the shadow is not a disease. So this is the way the analyst experiences, right? The analyst does not necessarily suffer directly from this phenomenon as he would from an illness. Yet, in the language of Freudian psychoanalysis, one could also say that the entanglement in the shadow is at the same time a superb defense mechanism which protects the analyst from much pain and trouble. The neurotic, destructive, and unconscious elements of the archetype, of the archetypal shadow, are no longer the problem of the psychotherapist. So what he's saying is that one of the tragic aspects of our work is that the more we work with shadow, the more at risk we are of ignoring shadow and of being blind to shadow. And this is something that we really need to work on, because it is intrinsic in our practice that we're going to start to distance ourselves from shadow because we are working so much in shadow, right? Let's keep on going. Finally, he says, The Jungian analyst cannot escape the fact that analysis is an asymmetrical relationship, and it becomes progressively more asymmetrical as the analyst gains in age and experience, so that the patient's challenge to the psychic processes in the analyst becomes smaller. The split in the archetype on the one hand, the one hand, the healthy doctor, and on the other, the sick patient, makes the dialogue between them increasingly more difficult. So again, Guggenheim, in his, I think, very sort of poignant way, is saying the better the analyst, so the fact that an analyst becomes better and more analyzed and more psychological, more developed, more differentiated, actually hinders the process, because it is more difficult for the analyst to be truly open, for the analyst to be truly effective. So the wiser, the more developed, the more analyzed the analyst is, the more he has to be aware of his defenses towards being open to psychic processes. Right? Anyway. And again, for me, one place where this is really clear is money and inequality, right? The solution to such difficulties cannot come from within. Very important. The more the analyst analyzes, examines, and follows the dictates of his unconscious, the more blind he becomes. He is merely confirmed in what he already knows. His blind spots prevents him from seeing the decisive dark areas of his own being, or if he grasps at them intellectually, he is still not emotionally gripped by his self-knowledge. So again, it's this thing about how the more conscious one is, the more difficult it is to relate psychologically, because the more easy it becomes to pretend like you're relating psychologically. What was so brilliant about what my analyst told me in that interpretation was that it was not an intellectual interpretation. He was truly both worried for me and pissed at me. He was angry at me and he was worried, both. He was emotionally engaged, but he was also irritated by me not paying. And because it was emotionally connected, it moved something in me. And although he was much older than me and much more experienced, he could go to a level where he could connect with his resentment and communicate it to me in a way that I could feel it. Okay? And to end on this same matter, let's just put it this way, because this whole paper is about the attempt to relate. This is Guggenheim, he says. Friendship intensely lived and intensely suffered saves many a therapist from an inextricable entanglement in his own dark and destructive side. The depths of the shadow must be plumbed in love. This is, I think, the core of what I want to say. This problem is not solvable, at least not in our lifetimes. What we can do is we can delve into it deeply through relationships, through friendships, through love, because it is in there where we can be confronted with our shadow, with our destructiveness, with our trickery, with our criminality, with those dark aspects of ourselves that, if lived consciously and deliberately, can bring the destruction that is needed in order for new life to come along. So anyway, thank you for your time. Thank you for your friendship, and I hope it wasn't too much.
Uau, meu amigo. Uau. Gustavo, parabéns.
Yeah, well, whatever, I don't know.
Que belo, duro e incômodo percurso que você nos trouxe e também nos causou. Fiquei até meio tonto. Vamos lá. Bom, perguntas abertas para o Gustavo. Quem quiser fazer, bota o nome no chat. Tá? Patrícia Eugênio, não vou nem fazer a primeira. E você, amiga?
Oi, Gustavo. Boa tarde. Estão me ouvindo?
Sim.
Yes, I can.
Ok.
Yes.
Sempre bom te ouvir, sempre uma fala de carga afetiva, humanizada, o que faz uma diferença imensa ao te ouvir. Gustavo, a questão do dinheiro, ela é uma questão cara a mim. Tenho escrito e tenho falado bastante a respeito da nossa remuneração, da dificuldade que a gente tem como analista de lidar com o dinheiro. Como disse Hillman, a César o que é de César. No castelo de César não é o castelo de Deus, onde há o profano, o dinheiro não, o dinheiro está dentro, o divino fica fora. Mas eu queria te fazer uma outra pergunta. Quando a gente encontra analistas junguianos que se esquivam de pacientes que têm uma falha ficcional, uma dificuldade simbólica, um aprofundamento deficitário na sua fala, e ele se nega a atender esse paciente porque não é possível colocar no seu contrato a interpretação de sonhos, a gente está criando dessa forma, ou esses colegas estão criando, uma elite muito diferente da que é feita através do dinheiro?
I mean, and one of the main purposes, I would say, of what I was writing, and tell me if I'm addressing what you're saying, is to put the spotlight on the failings of us as analysts or as therapists, right? So when we say, and this is also in a paper by Guggenbiel, I maybe have it here, yeah, where he said, let me see if I can find it, but when we either reject, or even if we don't reject, when we assume that a patient, cannot symbolize or they don't dream, is that a failure in the patient or is that a failure in ourselves? Is that something that, are we incapable of, so why do we need it to look like a symbol for us to think that it's symbolic? That's kind of my point. If we can obviously talk clinically about, patients who have difficulty with symbolization and the way we usually construct it. But if we're really thinking about the objective psyche, about an archetypal realm, it is really difficult to think that a person is not embedded in that symbolic system. So, I mean, right now, perhaps because I've just presented this, I'm a little bit more aggressive than I usually am. So I'm just going to go in. So what I would say is that if when we do that, that's our defensiveness. That is our own laziness of not really, and I mean, also if we attach it to capitalism, it is treating the patient as a part. Oh, they're not Jungian material. They don't dream enough. They don't speak enough in symbolic language. They don't want to talk about a fairy tale. But that is imposing our narrative onto their psyche, right? Instead of trying, I mean, and that where that is very obvious is when Jung obviously, but also Jungians, when they engage with non-European mythological traditions, they don't treat it symbolically in their own terms. They try to translate it symbolically into their own logic, right? So it's the same thing. If we have an individual that doesn't comply with the characteristics or with the list that we say, oh, you dream and you engage with this and blah, 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 we are not examining the social, economic, and cultural background that supports that assumption that that's what symbolic is. The example that I always put there is how, like when I am with American analysts, it is very common. They assume that the way they feel, that the way they experience feeling, the way they relate to feeling, is the proper way of relating to feeling. That is the mature psychological way. And sometimes what they do is they confuse being passive aggressive with being psychologically mature. No? And me, because I come from a culture that is more expansive, it is more, affect is more active, it is more relational. We yell at each other. Oh, you're in complex. No, you are not symbolizing. And they do not take the time to stop and think, like, where does that assumption come from? That I need to go in and reflect on my feeling and then come to you. That is your own defensiveness. No? The same thing goes for symbols or dreams. Why do we think that if someone doesn't bring us a dream or doesn't do an active imagination as Jung did, sort of, then they're not, that is a very colonial image of what soul is. And the thing is, the viewpoint itself is not a problem. I mean, if that's the European way, that's the European way. What is colonial is assuming that that is the way of being symbolic, or that is the way of being psychological. And the problem, of course, is that because historically Jungian psychology, it emerged in Europe, no? And it emerged, so those of us that don't come from there need to be able to resist that tendency. And also, I mean, in my case, I think in many ways, this paper is my resistance to assimilate to the culture, to sort of just like kind of go into their logic and say, oh yeah, I have to be like them. I don't have to be like them. I can listen to them, I can connect with them, but not because historically that's where the power or I mean, why are there so many, analysts in the US? Because there's a lot of money there, because rich people went to Europe, analyzed with Jung, and then came back and had the money to set up institutes. That's the reason. I mean, it's more complex, but that is a very important reason. And that is the way that a specific modality of imagining or constructing symbolization, affect, relationship sort of is imposed into what is allegedly a human process, which is many cultural expressions. So my sense, I mean, I don't know if this is what you're asking, but my sense is that it's a defensive move on the part of the analyst. It goes very much to the heart of what Guggenbill was saying, that the analyst is incapable of meeting that which doesn't fit with his own paradigm. No? So because it doesn't fit with what I'm used to thinking, I've symbolized or I've engaged with symbolization like this for 40 years, right? So when someone does it differently, I want to make them do it like me, and I assume that is helping them. No? I mean, that's Catholic priests in America. I mean, coming to evangelize people who didn't want to be evangelized, bringing this truth. So, and as non-European or let's say, first world Jungians, part of I'm going to talk in first person, part of my struggle there is not to fall prey into the temptation of just saying like, oh yes, I'm going to do it like they do it. No, because that'll give me more access to power, and that'll give me more access to the community, and then I'm going to come here to my country and do my evangelization myself, and tell them how they do it, and So my sense is that in those micro moments when a patient comes in and does not sort of adapt to our frame of reference, the challenge is how do we relate to that, yes, symbolically, but meeting them halfway, meeting them where they are. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of what it triggered. Does it? Yeah.
Sim, Gustavo respondeu, obrigada. Vem ao encontro de algo que eu sempre falo: o paciente não precisa ser profundo, eu preciso ser, para que eu possa ter uma escuta profunda a respeito dele.
Exactly.
Obrigada.
Sometimes depth is in the surface. sometimes to be deep is to stay with what's there.
Sim,
No? Okay.
sim. Saber que está na superfície.
Exactly.
Obrigado, Patrícia. Hugo, está contigo.
Hello, Gustavo. Can you hear me well?
Hugo, fala em português melhor com a gente.
Português, né? Eu só não estou vendo o Gustavo agora, não sei porquê. Deixa eu ver aqui. Pronto.
I'm right here. I'm right here.
All right, Gustavo.
Yeah, right
Sim, Gustavo, assim, eu pensei em algumas coisas, né? Assim, com a sua apresentação, que foi muito boa, por sinal, né? Muito obrigado. Né? E em algum momento, né? Assim, você comentou, né? Assim, sobre a questão da meia-idade, né? E parece que você está na meia-idade também. E aí eu imaginei, assim, você, né? Assim, nesse teu perfil, né? Como, ao mesmo tempo, né? Simultaneamente, estudante, aluno e educador, né? Eu vi aquela imagem, né? Assim, da justiça, né? Que você apresentou, né? Com os dois pratos, né? Avaliando, julgando, medindo, né? E aí eu gostaria de fazer essa pergunta para você, né? Assim, how would you weight plates? Porque, né? Assim, recentemente eu estava na Suíça, né? E aí, curiosamente, lá no Instituto C.G. Jung, eu também conheci um outro mexicano que também estava, né, fazendo treinamento lá em Chicago. E eu achei interessante, assim, né? Esse movimento de vocês irem para lá, né? Parece ser uma jornada, né? Tão grande, né? Então, eu gostaria de saber isso de você, né? Assim, como é que você iria medir esses pratos?
What Oh, okay. But this plate, which are the two plates? Sort of my.
Well, you know, being at the same time the students, you know, the one that's soaks in all the knowledge and is paying, you know, dearly for it, but at the same time, you know, the one who, you know, is a doctor, has a PhD, and is an authority figure.
I think I handle it very clumsily. That's what I think. I think that I am I mean, I don't know if this is just part of of being, because I am middle-aged. Like I'm 42 years old, and I am professionally in a place where I am not a jungian analyst yet. No, like I am, you know, and that whatever, that fetish of being a jungian analyst, and I can feel still sort of the places where my thinking and my feeling and my practice is still green in a way, like still not mature enough, but I can also feel the other place. So what I would say is, my impression is that in a way, I think that's why I wanted to make this emphasis on feeling, because I feel my way through it, because there are moments, even today in the presentation, I could feel how there were moments where I was really struck. I felt really overpowered by the material. I felt really inadequate. And there are others where I feel very much like, yes, this is what I want to say. And I think that the reason why I want to, I mean, the trickster is important, and this whole notion of, is because being able to move through those moments of feeling inadequate, feeling inferior, feeling still like a student that has a lot to learn, feeling like you're too young, like you're not there yet, and also being able to connect with, okay, I know what I'm saying, this is important for me, this matters, blah, blah, blah. And being able to sort of navigate through those two without identifying with either. I think that's something that's useful when you're my age, when you're 42, because I mean, I still have to struggle with a bunch of stuff. No, I mean, practical stuff. No, for me, in many ways, this is important. For example, for me, being a therapist is still a job in the sense that I make a living out of it. Like that is how I pay my bills. right? So that brings certain tension. There are many older analysts or that don't do it, so that they do it more from a different place. And I can say, I mean, like, oh, but I'm, whatever, I'm 75 and I could be retired, but I see 5 patients, a week. That is a very different place to be. So for me right now, I feel that this moment is, I just have to really make my way through it one step at a time, because I go from feeling like, oh yes, this is really what I'm trying to say. So like, this makes a lot of sense, to like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever said. So being able to hold those things together, the inadequacy and the, as you say, the authority, in the sense like, okay, like, I mean, I'm not just talking just because I'm talking. I've thought about this, but 1,000 other people have thought about this, and so I think that's also why I like the story of Borges, because there was this thing about, there was this really young, eager Borges, trying to do this and trying to make his way in the world. And there was this old, kind of jaded, skeptical, almost cynic Borges talking, and they fed each other, right? They somehow connected, and they gave life to each other in different ways. So I guess the easy way to frame what you're asking is, I just try to remain very conscious about my division, about how I am split, and how I have not resolved that split. And I'm a work in progress. I guess that's what I would say.
Obrigado. Mas, assim, uma pequena adendo, né? Assim, como é que você vê, né, assim, esse balanço no mundo junguiano, né? Assim, essa medida, né?
In the world?
No mundo junguiano, né? Com todas as diferenças.
I think there is very little consciousness of that division. I mean, for instance, like the way I see it, like I come here to Tiasos or to other forums, and for me, it is very refreshing. Like I'm very like I can be a student and I don't care. Like I feel very free. If I go to other instances, like the union world, in my experience, is very split between the holy cows, or how do you call it? No, like these very big figures, and a lot of people in other countries that are trying to emerge, but that, for example, for me, it's very interesting that in other countries, they are very unaware of communities of unions that are not European or American. It is very split yet. I mean, for those of you who went to Buenos Aires to the IAP conference, there were almost no Europeans. There were very few Europeans. I mean, and you can say it's because of COVID or because of whatever, but the truth is,
Argentinians even.
Exactly. Well, and that was because of money in many cases. But anyway, so there is, I would say, a real split between emerging communities, because there are a lot of emerging communities in the Jungian world. And if you see, I mean, Marcos is a great example. Like everybody loves Marcos because it's like, wow, there's so much life there. And yeah, I mean, they can see how there is something arising in other places that are not Switzerland or London or the United States, but it is still very split. That's how I experience it as a member of the community. Like I can feel my personality adjust to where I am. Like over there, I am like, here, I am much more relaxed. Over there, I am much more sort of combative. Like I am much more like, because I feel I need to fight something that's much more powerful than me. And particularly, they are very unaware of these communities, or they're starting to become aware, but they don't really have a feel of it. That's my sense. That's my own experience. I don't know if it's true, but and I think that a challenge for the union community is how that's going to be integrated. And I think people like Marcus, people like Stefano, like there's people that are trying to do, Andrew even. They're trying to connect those communities. But then the trick is how to do that without and avoiding the colonial problem, without it being evangelical. No? So without them coming to bring their truth or coming to exploit our whatever. I don't know. I mean, that's a difficult question, and it was a bit of a fumbly answer, but I think there's a big split that is still trying to connect, and it's actually a crucial problem, I would say. How to bridge those communities.
Thank you.
Meu amigo, última pergunta por causa do tempo. O tempo ficou escasso.
Yeah.
Queria te trazer uma questão. Quando eu li esse teu texto, eu li no capítulo, no livro sobre o outro, né? Eu fiquei bem impactado, acho que eu até te escrevi na época, elogiando o teu texto. Vendo você falar agora, algumas coisas talvez ficaram um pouco mais claras para mim. Primeiro, eu te perguntaria assim, a gente poderia pensar esse teu texto quase como um manifesto político? Esse texto ele tem um tom de um manifesto político, psicológico, social. Então, minha primeira pergunta, esse texto ele é uma marcação de uma posição tua na comunidade junguiana? Primeira pergunta. E por que eu falo isso? Porque há algum tempo, dentro da própria comunidade junguiana, como você falou agora, fórum da IAJS, a sua figura tem ganho um destaque como uma figura não europeia, não americana. Você se tornou quase um certo representante desses territórios não europeus ou não americanos. E a tua presença efetivamente tem uma voz, tem uma repercussão e tem um respeito pela qualidade do teu texto, pela qualidade das tuas intervenções. Então, a gente poderia pensar que, de alguma maneira, esse texto vai nessa direção. E aí tem duas questões que eu queria também marcar, do Sênex e do Trickster. Você sabe que eu gosto de te chamar de Sênex, né? Mas tem alguma coisa de um Sênex que seria afirmar uma certa raiz de origem? Você é mexicano. Você trabalha e recebe em pesos. Você não recebe em dólar. Trabalhar 50 horas para pagar uma sessão de $150, essa é uma imagem violentíssima, me parece, de uma violência imensa. Então, essa dimensão do Sênex como afirmação de uma tradição do lugar de onde você veio, do lugar onde você trabalha, da moeda que você recebe, tem a ver com isso. E a dimensão trickster é você infiltrado na comunidade junguiana internacional por aí, às vezes se sentindo desajeitado, às vezes se sentindo atrapalhado, mas um trickster que traz uma boa nova, que traz a diferença, que traz algum elemento disruptivo, novo. Acho que é um momento bastante interessante. Não é exatamente uma pergunta, mas eu queria que você pudesse comentar um pouco. Faz sentido essas imagens que me ocorreram, meu amigo?
Yeah. That last part about the sentence, I would say I actually I had not thought about it that way, but I liked it. And what I would say is, when I connect with that energy, that is when I mean, returning to the previous question, that is when I do say, that is the Sênex energy. Like, this has to be said. No? However it is received, whatever impact it has, this is not the whole truth, but it is a part of the truth, and a part of the truth that is being neglected. So, and that is when I get very sort of mad, like, this is happening, no? Like, for a regular psychologist to go into analysis, it would take him this much to pay, and you have to hear this. And if you, I mean like powerful, whoever, and if you don't hear it, that is an ethical, political, and psychological choice you are making. No, because I think that many sort of like people in the elites, and here I include myself, often kind of excuse their neglect or their ignorance and like, well, I didn't know. Okay, you didn't know? Let me let you know. And that there I am very adamant. Then when it comes to sort of a more kind of big picture, like what you asked before, like, I mean, I don't think, I personally don't experience it as a manifesto. I experience it, if you want, sort of as a manifestation of like, there are voices that are not heard, and they need to be heard. And I happen to be, and that's why I made a point of my positionality. I come from a place which is collectively underprivileged. But my position in that community is of extreme privilege. So I am the one that has the possibility and I would say responsibility of making way for other voices that just, and again, this is very literal, that some voices are not heard because they don't speak English. It is that simple. Or because they don't speak German. Well, that's not even a matter. I mean, so like, oh well, there's brilliant people, brilliant Jungians that they just don't write in English or they don't write in German. So how are they going to be read? It is very, so because of my position, I was raised in a place where I learned English and I can interact with these people. And yeah, I guess in that sense, I play sort of a bridge. I mean, with Vala Quirvel, the Argentinian, with Vala, I joke that I have this sort of karma of being a bridge, no, and I don't really belong anywhere. And I think that's very Mexican, actually, because Mexico being sort of the furthest north in Latin America and being right next to the United States, kind of karma. Like, you cannot ignore the United States, no. But also you want to be part of Latin America. But then Latin America is so far. So I think in a way I'm embodying that bridge aspect of like, okay, I'm here. My culture is this sort of, in between trickstery culture, whatever. Let's try and do it. Like training in Chicago, for instance. So yeah, I don't see it as a manifesto. I see it as, I see it as a manifestation that is very intimate, very personal, but also political in the sense that I want to subject my inner experience to the political sphere. And in that way, it is a political manifestation. I don't like, yeah. Also, if you see it as a manifesto in sort of a very kind of discreet way, and in the way like, well, everybody should do this and do their own manifesto, then yes, no? But in the sense of like, how do I go deep into my personal practice and experience and make that political and make that be heard? Well, I guess that's, and again, the reason I ended and because I don't want with those quotes from Guggenbiel, because I could really not do that were it not for the relationships. I could not do that were it not because I come here and I'm with you, Juan Lucian, and all these people that I and we can be real with each other. We can connect. And then one day when we meet in whatever years, we can have a beer. And then there's love, there's intimacy, there's something. Otherwise, I don't care. Why would I do it? No. So I want to make those relationships political. No, that, yeah, I don't know if that makes anything, but thank you for the invitation, my friend. I really appreciate it. I hope it was useful or interesting or whatever, and And thank you. I appreciate it.
Amigo, sempre um prazer te receber. Acho que você traz sempre questionamentos absolutamente instigantes, pouco óbvios, né? Você traz a coisa pelo avesso então é sempre um exercício muito interessante te escutar e acompanhar o teu argumento, o teu raciocínio. Obrigado novamente. Ó, eu e a Luciana, em nome do Tiaços, você sabe que aqui é a sua casa. Volte sempre. Espero que a gente possa nos revermos pessoalmente em breve. Te agradeço a atenção, amigo. Muito obrigado.
Yeah, totally.
Dê um
Thank
grande
you.
abraço
Thank you,
no
Luciana. Thank you, Isa. Thank you so much.
grande abraço no Francisco, na Ana,
Igualmente.
tá bem? Se
I
cuide,
will.
se cuide, amigo.
You
Pessoal,
too.
obrigado pelo
Bye.
encontro. Esse texto que o Gustavo apresentou, eu postei no grupo do WhatsApp, tá? Acho que todos têm acesso a ele. Quem não tiver acesso, me manda que eu posso mandar novamente. Nos encontramos novamente. Luciana, qual é o próximo?
O próximo é no sábado que vem. Dessa vez vai ser sábado, não sexta. Então, presta atenção, às 10 da manhã, com o Steven Buzzer, falando das obras completas da Von Franz.
Sábado que vem já?
É já.
Tá bom. Até a próxima, gente, com a Wolfranz, então. Tá bom? Um beijo. Isa, obrigado pela tradução. Até a próxima, todos. Até lá.